So the parables. This, of course, is an important subject because it has to do with the teaching of Jesus. Jesus was a master teacher. You'll remember after the Sermon on the Mount, the crowds were astonished because he taught as one having authority and not as the scribes. Whenever this man spoke, people were astonished. They were amazed at what he said. And wouldn't it have been wonderful to sit at the feet of Jesus? People have pointed out that he never wrote a word, but he taught, and his disciples were there, and they took down his words, and we are grateful that we can read them and imagine what it was like to be there. And most importantly, feed off of the nourishment of his instruction. He taught in different ways. Of course, we have a lot of sermons. And I was talking to Don Wilson about the book of Matthew. Don is teaching Matthew, Mark, and Luke in Pohnpei. And Matthew is structured around 5 big sermons. The most prominent being the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5 through 7. But you also have the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. You have different teachings, and Matthew weaves his narrative in and out of those sermons that you have. Of course, the other gospel accounts contain sermons of Jesus, and that's a format we're very familiar with. A lot of Jesus' teaching was informal and surrounded his miracles. One example I like is from Mark chapter 2, where the men are lowering their friend through the roof of the house there. He's called a paralytic. Probably he was unable to move. We don't know if he's paralyzed from the waist down. There's not a whole lot of detail. There's even some question whether paralysis was his problem. But he was so immobile that he couldn't go to Jesus on his own, and he was confined to a bed. They dug a hole in the roof where Jesus was teaching, so there you see the popularity of Jesus' teaching. And they lower him through the roof, and he was amazed at their faith. And you remember what he said to the sick man? He said, "My son, your sins are forgiven." And this enraged the scribes and Pharisees who were there. They were looking for reasons to discredit him anyway. And they thought to themselves, this man commits blasphemy. Who can forgive sin except for God? And Jesus knew their thoughts. And he took this as an opportunity to teach them something very important about himself. He said, which is easier, to say to this man, your sins are forgiven, or to tell him, take up your bed and walk? Now, which one is easier to say? It's easier to say your sins are forgiven because there's no evidential proof that he's right or wrong in that. I mean, only God knows if his sins were truly forgiven. It's harder to tell him, take up your bed and walk, because then there's evidential proof whether he could really do what he said he could do. The man would either still lie there on his bed, proving Jesus wrong, or he would get up and walk, proving him right. And so he said, so that you know the Son of Man has the power to forgive sins, he told the man to get up and walk. The man got up and walked, went on his way rejoicing, and everybody was amazed. You see Jesus teaching around his miracles a lot like that. John's gospel account is built around 7 signs. That was John's word for miracle. He liked that word sign because miracles weren't just wonders to amaze people, but they symbolized or signified something. And so Jesus would feed 5,000, and then he would say, I am the bread of life. Or he would raise Lazarus from the dead, and he would say, I'm the resurrection and the life. So the teaching was tied to the miracles. And that comes through really well in the book of John. Some of his most pointed teaching resulted from debates that the scribes and Pharisees would draw him into. Matthew 22 is full of these examples. The Sadducees challenged him regarding the resurrection. So he gives some important teaching on that. Some of them challenge him on other issues like paying taxes, and he was challenged on divorce and remarriage. And whenever he was challenged, he skillfully and eloquently handled those debates, and the result is teaching that we benefit from. But if Jesus had a favorite way to teach, I guess it probably would be the parables. He enjoyed illustrating and conveying truth through stories. So let's talk a little bit about what parable does. And we're not going to get into a specific parable this morning. I want to talk about the meaning of a parable first from the word translated parable, which is just transliteration from the Greek word. And then I'm going to go to Matthew 13, and we're going to look at 4 purposes of parables. So first, the word itself. Parable is a transliteration from the Greek word parabole. And that's a compound word. Para is a prefix meaning alongside. And bole means to throw. To illustrate para, I'll go back to Mark 2, where there's a paralytic. Paralytic comes from a Greek word paralupto. And I had a preacher come up to me one time whose brother has Parkinson's disease like I do. And he said, I think Parkinson's is in the Bible. I said, where do you find that? And he said, well, where they translate paralytic, he said the Greek word is paralupto. Para means alongside or on one side. Lupto means to loose. And if you look at me, I'm loose on one side. One side has a tremor or, a stiff or, doesn't operate like the other side. Now, I don't think it's right. I mean, I wish I could look in there, but the paralysis of those days seems to be a lot more common than Parkinson's, which was very rare until recently. But if you look at that paralupto, para means alongside and loose in that case. And this word, parable, para means alongside, and bole means to throw. So a parable is something thrown alongside something else. So immediately you get this sense of a comparison. And what is being compared? A story is being compared to a spiritual truth. Now, another word for that is projection. And I want to talk about projection by going to an unusual place, the Arabian Nights. Maybe you've heard some of the stories from the Arabian Nights or the 1001 Nights of Persian tradition. Aladdin and the lamp is one story. Sinbad is another story. These stories come from this collection, treasure house of Persian tales that was finally compiled, I think, in the 1700s or something like that. But they go way back into ancient tradition. And there is a frame story that pulls all those stories together about a vizier, which is like a Persian official in the court, whose job it was to procure virgins for the king because he would marry a woman every evening and execute her the next day. He did this because his first wife cheated on him and he came to not trust women. And this is how he lived out his rage. He would marry a woman every night and have her executed in the morning. Well, this vizier was running out of virgins. This is a limited resource, and he had a daughter. And his daughter was one of the last ones in the city, in the kingdom. And she volunteered to be the next bride. And he said, I don't want to execute you. And she said, I don't plan on being executed. Now, his daughter was named Shahrazad, and she was a very intelligent, beautiful woman. And she said, here's my plan. I will marry the king, and I will tell him a story. And I will make the story last until morning, and then I won't tell him the end of the story. And it'll be such a good story that he'll let me live till the next evening so that he can hear the end, at which time I'll tell another story and leave him with a cliffhanger the next morning, and so on until the cycle is broken. That's the frame story of Arabian Nights, and that's why there's 1,001 tales, because it took her a long time to get him over this cycle of executing his wives. But in response to her plan, her father tells her a story. Okay, now I want to talk about the story that her father tells. Now remember that this woman is wanting to break this cycle of murder by outwitting the king. So her father tells the story about an ox and a donkey. Okay, here's the story. There was a farmer who could understand all languages, even the languages of animals. And he had an ox and a donkey. Now the ox came in from the fields one day exhausted. And he walks by the stall of the donkey and he noticed that it's very clean, fresh straw in the trough, fresh water, and the donkey looked rested and well. And the ox, who was exhausted, said, how is it that we belong to the same farmer, and I'm exhausted and sore from burden and work, and you're fresh and well rested, and your stall is clean, and your trough is full of fine hay? And the donkey said, well, I'll tell you my secret. He said, whenever they put the yoke on me, I lay down under the burden and made like I was sick. And they tried to give me food to eat, and I wouldn't eat it for a few days. And they were so worried about me, they put me in the stall and they took care of me. What you need to do tomorrow when they put the yoke on your neck, lay down under the burden as if you're sick, and when they offer you food or water, refuse to eat until they bring you back to the barn and give you a stall like they've done me. Now keep in mind the farmer is listening to this, and you can understand what they're saying. The next day, the plowman comes, he puts the yoke on the ox, and the ox follows the donkey's instruction. He lays down under the burden, he won't move, pretends that he's sick, he won't eat, and the plowman brings him back to the barn. He says to the farmer, I can't do anything with this animal, something's wrong with it. And the farmer says, hitch the yoke up to the donkey, he will pull your plow. Now, the vizier doesn't tell Shahrazad what that story means. He knows she's smart enough to get it. And he knows, the one who writes this knows that we're smart enough to get it. We're smart enough to know that she has this plan. I'm going to tell stories to stay alive. I'm going to use my wits to stay alive. And I'm going to step in and save all the virgins of the kingdom. And he's saying, beware of using your wits to save others, because you might wind up being the one who suffers. But none of that is told, it's just put out there. The story is projected. Now, in Mark Turner's book, The Literary Mind, Origins of Thought and Language, he talks about the Arabian Nights, and in particular the story of the ox and donkey, and how it talks about story and projection. And I want to share some of this with you as we think about the parables. He says, narrative imaging, which is just story, is the fundamental instrument of thought. Rational capacities depend on it. It is our chief means of looking into the future, of predicting, of planning, and of explaining. It is a literary capacity indispensable to human cognition. In other words, story is our fundamental way of thinking. And what do you think about that? Have you ever said to somebody who's trying to teach you, show me how to do it, I learn better by example than by teaching? Or have you ever been fascinated by a preacher or a teacher who can illustrate really well, and because of his illustrations, you understand the truth so much better? That's because our fundamental means of thinking is story. That's how you memorize lists. You know, a lot of you know that I do boxing for Parkinson's. It's not, real boxing. It's just a training program for Parkinson's. And one of the things they do is they give us 5 words because they also work on our cognition. And what I do to memorize those words is I put them in a story. Now listen, some of these stories are really weird, and I would never want anybody to know what they are, because in order to get those words to go together, sometimes you got to come up with some pretty crazy ideas. But once I get them into a story, I'm not going to forget them. Try that with your grocery list. Try it with a series of words you need to memorize. Even Scripture, you can kind of put the verse into its context, into the story, and you can remember it better. Our fundamental way of thinking is story. I agree with that. I don't know, what do you think? Now, he goes on from that, and here's the next argument. He says, this projection, he's talking about the story of the ox and bull that the father told his daughter, and how he projected that story. He said, this projection of one story onto another may seem exotic and literary, and it is, but it is also, like story, a fundamental instrument of the mind. Rational capacities depend on it. It is a literary capacity indispensable to human cognition generally. This is the second way in which the human mind is essentially literary. So the first way that we think is story. He says the second fundamental way that we think is by projecting stories. So it's one thing to come up with a story and know the basic structure of story and enjoy the story or learn from the story. But then can you compare the story to other stories? Human beings do that all the time, and this projection is a second way that we think and understand things and understand the world around us. So he ties it into parables like this. Parable, remember the meaning of the word parable, parabole, to throw a story alongside something else. Parable begins with narrative imaging, the understanding of a complex of objects, events, and actors as organized by our knowledge of story. So parable begins with a story. He could have just said it like that, but he had to use all his big words. It then combines story with projection. In other words, casting alongside. One story is projected, cast alongside onto another. The essence of parable is its intricate combining of two of our basic forms of knowledge, story and projection. So you get why it's so effective that Jesus used parables. Jesus, who created the mind, knows how we think. And so he knows the fundamental ways of cognition are story and projection. And so his teaching involves those two fundamental aspects of our thinking. Number one, he tells a story, and then he throws it down alongside spiritual truth so that we can understand. Isn't that interesting? I found that to be really interesting and something that human beings have been doing all along. So that's the basic idea of what a parable is. Now from there I want to go to Matthew chapter 13. As I said before, there are 4 purposes of parables in Matthew chapter 13. And we're going to look at them and hear Jesus in his own words explain why he's teaching in parables. The first reason is to fulfill prophecy. We're going to skip over to Matthew 13, 34 and 35, where Matthew says, "All these things Jesus said to the crowds in parables. Indeed, he said nothing to them without a parable. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world." So Matthew tells us that one of the reasons Jesus spoke in parables was to fulfill prophecy. Specifically, this prophecy that he quotes here. Now, the quotation is from Psalm 78, verse 2. And in the introduction or the superscription of that psalm, it's attributed to Asaph, who in other places is called a seer or a prophet. So this is a messianic prophecy by Asaph the seer, who says that when the Messiah comes, he's going to teach in parables. Isaiah sees that fulfillment in some of the parables told in Matthew chapter 13. We won't go back and read the psalm, but it depicts God's great works and the love that he has for his people. It tells of the rebellion that's characteristic of many of the people. It's a psalm that we looked at when we studied David, and it refers to David as a shepherd of the people. Maybe you recall that discussion. So Matthew sees in that a fulfillment in Jesus Christ. So that's probably the easiest part of this. Getting a little deeper, we'll back up to verses 10 through 17. And this next one is how we usually think of parables. When you were in Bible class, you probably learned that a parable is an earthly story with, can you finish it? A heavenly meaning. I remember the little flashcards. We had like a curtain hanger. Well, is that what you call those little clips? And my teacher, Bible class teacher, would have little 3x5 cards and punch holes in them. And we'd have flashcards, and she'd give us new ones every week. And we'd put them on that little curtain hanger, and we'd go over them at the beginning of class. And one of them on one side said parable, and I remember on the other side it said earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And I remember that to this day, and I think I learned that in first grade or somewhere along there. So that stuck with us. Well, this is the second reason in Matthew. First reason Jesus gives for giving parables is to illustrate, to make truth clear. Now, the way he explains it is in terms of the haves and have-nots. And he says, I tell parables to make the truth clear to those who have. We'll talk about what they have in a moment, but let's read what he says, beginning verse 10. Then the disciples came and said to him, why do you speak to them in parables? And he answered them, to you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Okay, let's pause right there for a moment and think about what he has just said. He says, you have something, speaking to the disciples, that helps you to understand what I'm saying in parables. So the question is, what is it that they have? Do they have maybe superior spiritual understanding? I don't think that's what it is, because he says in verse 11 they had to be given the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. The word mystery means that which is hidden. So they don't have any more spiritual insight than any other human being. That spiritual insight has to be given to them. It's not something they can discover on their own. Neither do they have more worldly wisdom. Later on, two of those disciples, Peter and John, are preaching, and according to Acts 4:13, People are amazed at their teaching because they're uneducated men. They were fishermen. The other disciples were just working class men. Only one of the disciples was able to have access to the schools of elite around Jerusalem. You know which one that was? Judas Iscariot. So it didn't work out too well with him. The rest of them were working class guys. Now they were obviously intelligent, but they didn't have any special training that the others didn't have. That's not what it is that they had. What they had is described in verse 9. He who has ears, let him hear. Now, was he like, my grandfather had exotic goats, and some of the goats that he had didn't have exterior ears, and they looked weird. If you want to see something that looks weird, think about a goat with no ears. Is he saying they didn't have ears, physical ears? Of course not. He's saying some people have open hearts and some people don't. Some people want to know what I'm teaching, and they see me as a teacher of spiritual insights that they need, and some people don't. That's what he's saying. In fact, let's go down to verse 16. He says to the disciples, "Blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For truly I say to you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see and did not see it, and to hear what you hear and did not hear it." They longed to. That's what the ears to hear are. Ears that long to hear. Eyes that long to see. Go down to verse 23. This is the explanation of the parable of the sower. And you remember there are 4 kinds of soils, and one of the soils is the good soil. Well, he describes that as what was sown on good soil. This is the one who hears the word and understands it. He indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, in another 30. In Luke chapter 8, verse 15, that version of the explanation of the parable, he says that the good soil is an honest and good heart. So that's what the disciples had that made them able to understand the parables and made the parables an illustration for them. Parables helped them understand the truth because they had ears to hear. Let's go to the third purpose. The third purpose was to discipline the have-nots. Some had ears to hear, others did not have ears to hear. Now let's go back and read some of what he says, beginning in verse 12. I know we already read this, but to get the context, let's back up. Matthew 13:12. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Indeed, in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, you will indeed hear, but never understand. You will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them. Some people look at that and they go into this denominational teaching that before anybody can understand the truth, they have to have an operation of the Holy Spirit that's miraculous in nature, that opens their eyes so that they can read the Bible and understand it. That's not what's being taught here. It's clear in verse 15, after he says, the heart has grown dull, their ears they can barely hear, their eyes they have closed. They closed their eyes. You know, have you ever been watching something on TV and a scene comes up that you just don't want in your head, and you close your eyes so you don't see it? Or you're confronted with something out in the world that you didn't want to see, and you close your eyes hoping to keep from sinning anymore. What you're doing that, nobody's keeping you from doing that, in order to keep something out of your heart. And what Jesus is saying is there are people whose eyes are closed. In other words, we would say their hearts are closed or their ears are closed to understanding the truth. Kevin.
Here he fall into that same thing, like the guy that lives next to the railroad tracks. He doesn't even hear that train come by.
Yeah.
He has chosen, or when you're trying to watch a football game, the kids are in there just, making a bunch of ruckus, and you can tone them out.
Yeah. What's our term for that? We have a term for that. Yeah, I heard it over here. Selective hearing. Yeah. We have a way of making what we don't want to hear, we call it white noise. It's just, we know it's there, but it's not making any sense to us. Now, if we tuned into it, the kids or the train, we would start noticing it. It's kind of like, we have a lot of fluorescent lights in here that are old and they buzz. And I forgot who it was, but I was in a room one day and the lights were buzzing. I said, "Do you hear those lights buzzing?" And a few minutes later, the person I asked that said, "I wish you hadn't said that. That's all I can hear now." I didn't notice it until you said it. That's what we're talking about. These people who were enemies of Christ, they were prejudiced against him from the onset. He wasn't the Messiah they were looking for. He was from Nazareth. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? He was not the teacher they wanted to sit at the feet of and hear. And so these parables, while they revealed truth to those who had ears to hear, they concealed it from those who didn't, which was important because Jesus had a timeline he was on. You see this a lot in the book of John where he says, "My hour has not yet come." And as he gets closer to the cross, he says, "The hour is coming." And then when he's on the evening of his arrest, he says, "My hour has come." If he had come out of the gate teaching clearly everything that he had to share with mankind, his ministry would have lasted just a few days. They would have put him on the cross immediately. There's one of the parables, I think it's the one in Matthew 21 about the laborers in the vineyard that killed the king's son. And I'm paraphrasing, but at the end of it, the Pharisees say something like, "Hey, I think he's talking about us." He gets clearer as he gets closer to time, like he's controlling the time frame the whole time, making the parables clearer. Sometimes he'll just come out and explain the parables. Now, another thing about those who had ears to hear is if they didn't understand the parable, they would pull him aside and ask him, "What did you mean when you said this?" And in private, he would be plainer and explain it to them. And so having the story projected and then an explanation with it made it even plainer. And we have those explanations on many of them because we too are the ones with ears to hear. Okay, last one. And this goes back to some of the things we were saying about story in the beginning of class. Parables are given to enable us to remember great truths. You can just remember a story better than you can memorize plain teaching. When you tell something in your own words, basically you're telling a story. And we remember the stories first, and then we start thinking, okay, what did that mean? And then we start recalling the truths. That's the order. That's how it works. And so Jesus told these great little stories, and they reveal truth, they conceal truth, and they help us remember. Also identify him as the Messiah. That's how he explains it in Matthew 13. I want to get into kind of the outline we want to follow, But before I do that, do you have any comments or questions over what parables are generally and the meaning of them and what their purposes are? Did I miss it? Yeah, Cindy. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's why a lot of Jesus' stories are from the agrarian society. They involve farming, they involve crops and harvests. His audience, that was their daily life. And some of us may struggle with some of that, and we have to do a little background work because we don't live in that same kind of society. But yeah, they come home to us. They're personal to us in that way. Yeah, Becky. 78, verse 2. Yeah. Okay. There are all kinds of different ways that you can organize a class on parables. And I'm going to use the outline of a commentator, Arlen Hultgren, in his book on parables. I think this go around, it'd be interesting to go through them this way. And this isn't an exhaustive list. I just want to give you an idea of the headings, and I have a few examples of the parables so you can get an idea of what is meant by the headings. So we're going to start out with parables of the revelation of God. In other words, God telling us something about himself, who he is. And there's two headings under this. We'll start with parables of God's extraordinary forgiveness and grace. So one example of that is the unforgiving servant in Matthew 18. After Peter asked, how many times should my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Until 7 times. And Jesus says, I say not unto you until 7 times, but 70 times 7. So that reveals God's mercy. The second heading under the revelation of God is parables of God's extraordinary love for the lost. And there's that trio of parables in Luke 15, the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost sons that belong in that category. The next major heading, parables of exemplary behavior. So he's going to give us a hero or a villain and teach us either by example how to behave or how not to behave. The Good Samaritan, classic example of that. On the other side, the rich fool teaches us how not to be. Then there are parables of wisdom. These are almost like proverbs. A lot of the proverbs will paint you a little picture or tell a little story. So these are generally shorter, although not in every case. The wise and foolish builders that build their house on the rock and on the sand, that's an example of wisdom. Building a tower, counting the cost, Luke 14. Those are a couple examples of the parables of wisdom. Next major heading, parables of life before God. That means not prior to God, but life lived under the scrutiny of God. How you should live your life with knowledge of God's awareness of you. So we should be evangelists. Parable of the sower. The parable of the two debtors. These two men, one is forgiven by the king, but then he doesn't forgive the other. Or no, the two debtors, that's the one where the woman who's sinful anoints Jesus' feet, and then Jesus tells this quick little parable about one who's forgiven much and one who's forgiven little, who will love the master more. Well, the one who's forgiven more will love more. And so you have these parables where God is depicted as a master or a father in some cases. And that's how we should live our life in view of God's scrutiny. And then you have parables of final judgment. A lot of the information we get about Judgment Day, and particularly about everlasting punishment, comes from parables. That's interesting. That if you start looking at where do I get my ideas about hell, weeping and gnashing of teeth, for example, that's from a parable. Everlasting punishment, that's from a parable. So you have the weeds and the wheat, which tell us there will be a harvest at the end, and the angels will separate the good and the evil. The dragnet, the final judgment with the sheep and the goats, Matthew 25. And then there are allegorical parables. That's kind of a catch-all category where, allegories are similes where, A is compared to B and that kind of thing. And then finally, parables of the kingdom. Matthew 13 is entirely composed of parables of the kingdom. It's a huge, huge category of parables that describe life under the rule of God. So you have parables on the growth of the kingdom, parables of the joy of discovering the kingdom. And that's the outline we're going to follow. Obviously, we can't get to every parable. There's far too many to cover in 13 weeks or 12 weeks as it is. But we'll cover the basics, and hopefully you'll be able to learn some fresh insights on something you've studied your whole life. Thanks for your attention.